Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Just wanted to pose the question to you. What do you think is happening to Australian property prices at the moment? Are they rising? Are they falling? Are they going backwards? Are they falling a lot? Are they rising a little bit or a lot? What do you think? Because media keeps telling us about what's happening with what they call Australian property prices, and in my view there is no such thing as the Australian property market or a phenomenon called Australian property prices. We have lots of different markets. And it's this perpetual generalisation in our major newspapers, in particular, on a daily basis, that provides just a welter of misinformation and confuses and misleads real estate consumers about what's really going on, because we have so many different markets across Australia. And I think the problem is that most of our major media comes out of Sydney, and Sydney people tend to think that Sydney is pretty much all that matters, and what's happening in Sydney is pretty much what's happening in Australia. So while we had a booming market in Sydney, media coming out of Sydney kept telling us about the Australian property boom, which never really existed. Now that the Sydney market is moving into decline and seeing evidence of prices falling in Sydney, they've extrapolated that across the nation. Now they're telling us about the decline in Australian property prices. I think that readers and listeners in places like Hobart and Canberra, Perth, Newcastle, Geelong, many other places around Australia must wonder where these journalists get their information, because what's happening in their local patch is certainly not reflected in what they're reading in newspapers like The Australian, which I continue to believe has the worst real estate coverage anywhere in Australia. Right now, the Hobart market continues to go ballistic. It's rising very strongly. Properties are selling very fast, and there's double-digit growth in median house prices in Hobart at the moment. The Canberra market is also very strong, very low vacancies, rents are rising, prices are rising solidly, not in double digits, I don't think, but certainly very, very solid growth. And as the Sydney market is declining, the Canberra market is moving into a period of growth, and some forecasters I know are predicting that Canberra is going to lead the capital cities on price growth over the next 3 years. Then we have places like Adelaide and Brisbane. As a generalisation, prices there are not rising very fast, not in any great numbers, but they are rising. They're certainly not falling. So they don't fit the category that we're in generalised media, that Australian property prices are falling. And individual locations and precincts in those two cities have actually having pretty strong double-digit growth in their prices in the last 12 months. Then we have Perth. Perth's certainly not falling. Perth's actually doing the opposite. After 4 years of a tough market, Perth's actually recovering and moving into a growth phase. And certainly the top end of that market has shown very good price growth in the last 12 months. Most of the $1 million suburbs in Perth have recorded double-digit price growth in the last 12 months, which I think is a precursor to a general rise in that market. And you have many of the major regional markets. I mean, in major regional cities like Newcastle and Geelong, many suburbs in those regional cities have had growth in their median house prices of more than 20% in the last 12 months. So people sitting in those cities reading articles in The Australian and other major metropolitan newspapers telling them that Australian property prices are falling, and must wonder where those journalists get their information. And these are not isolated examples. There are many regional markets, particularly those that are quite close geographically to Sydney and Melbourne, have had very, very strong price growth in the last 12 months and continue to be growth markets. So I don't know whether it's ignorance or laziness, but the journalists who write these articles are misleading consumers with reports of national decline in property markets. It simply isn't so, and I hope that you're able to get better sources of information to tell you what's really going on in the individual markets around Australia and help you to decide the good places to buy. And a reminder that tomorrow night, as always, Tuesday evening, 7:30 in the eastern states, different times in the other states, including 5:30 p.m. in Western Australia. I'll be doing my weekly feature every Tuesday night, Hotspot of the Week. So tune in and find out which of the many locations around Australia that are growing, contrary to what media is telling us, that I'll be highlighting tomorrow night. So that's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. I'll talk to you again tomorrow night, if not sooner.